This video aims to break down how to analyze news coverage of an issue or event. Please note that the PDF of this is also on Classroom, so if I rush or skip over parts of the video, either pause it when you want to have a closer look or go into the PDF and read in more detail. The first thing you need to do is you need to choose the question you're going to answer. So you'll get a list of questions that you can answer in your exam like these. These are from the mock exam. And you need to choose the one that you feel best suits you and your story. Of course, which statement you choose to answer determines which aspects you then discuss. So if you want to discuss depth and duration of your news coverage of your story, then obviously you pick this question here. If you want to discuss the point of view, perhaps, of the coverage, then choose this one. For this example, I've chosen to discuss the extent and length or depth and duration of the media coverage and explaining the effect of it being covered this way. So you've chosen your question and therefore your aspects. You need to then summarize your event or issue briefly. So at the top of your essay, you'll just briefly describe the event that you've chosen. So I've said my event is the US presidential election campaign with a focus on the second presidential debate between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump on the 9th of October. So I've actually chosen to, I've put the context of the overall election campaign here, but I have chosen to focus in particular on the second presidential debate. So it makes it easier because I'm focusing on just one particular event in this. So first I've put a sentence here that kind of covers the overall coverage of the elections from the start till now, so since June 2015. And then I also talk about briefly the coverage of the second debate specifically, and I've put the dates that it started and to when it sort of ended. So third, you want to define, describe, and explain the aspects. Okay, so refer back to the question you chose. We chose, remember, depth and duration. So those are the aspects I now need to describe for my event. And you also need to give reasoned explanations for why it was covered in this way. The reasoned explanations can be any of these things here that you see down the bottom, okay? Now you can discuss the aspect and then the reasoned explanations in two separate paragraphs if you like. So you could start by doing your depth and duration, talk all about that, describe it, give examples in one paragraph or a couple paragraphs. Then in a separate paragraph, you could move on to the news values or the reasons. Or if you want, you can actually discuss them together. I find it easier discussing them together because for me, it's easy to talk about the depth and duration and then explain why it was that way at the same time. So in this example I'm going to give you here, I'm going to talk about them together, one after another. To help me, I'm going to use this table here, which just sort of has a step-by-step outline, I suppose, of how I can analyze this news coverage. So you can see this first row here is all about describing the aspect. So I chose depth and duration. So I need to give the definition of depth and the definition of duration, and I need to describe the depth of the coverage of the second debate and the duration of the coverage of the second debate. So both generally, so all the different sort of media that have covered it, national and international, but also specifically. So with my examples, which you'll see in a minute, the specific articles you're going to talk about, you need to talk about how in depth, how much detail they were covered in. Duration is the length of the coverage. So it could be how long this is featured in the media overall, like was it 1 week, 2 weeks, 2 days, but also how long was your specific articles or the average length of the articles you looked at. So you can move on now to looking at the example because that's going to help you to explain this aspect better. So the first example I've got here is a CBS News article. I would talk about the title, I would make sure I talk about the date. I'd make sure I describe the length or duration of the actual article. So I've done a word count and how long the overall coverage stayed in the media for. So I noticed that this actually stayed in the media in one form or another for actually about 10 days from this debate until the third debate. And then the depth, so I've looked at the article, I've seen how in-depth the coverage was. It's got different videos in it, links to other blogs and articles. I've looked at how many people or journalists were reporting in the article. Did it include any other perspectives? And of course a quote here, okay, because you do need to make sure you have as much evidence as possible when you're talking about your examples. And now I'm also going to include a second example, a second article, and I'm going to briefly also describe the duration of that. So I've got the word count here. It's actually twice as long as the CBS one, important to note, and the depth. And this one's a good one to compare because it actually has taken the approach of having 4 journalists giving perspectives in the article rather than just the one in the CBS one. And I've put a quote there as well of one of the focuses in the article. Then you need to explain what your examples show, okay? So you always need to give your examples and explain what they show. This is in our exam question. It said that you have to describe the depth and duration and explain the effect of this. So this is what this part here is all about, okay? The effect of the depth and duration, right? Was it balanced? How did it make it easier to digest for the average reader, which is what I've put there. I thought that these articles were trying to make something that's quite complex and complicated easy for the public to make sense of and form their opinions on. They're trying to come across as objective, and I've given quotes earlier that show that. And I've compared it with the second article. And I've decided to also include a third example because I noticed that one of the reasons for the duration or the length of the coverage staying in the media so long was that SNL did a sketch about the debate. They did a parody or a satire. They mocked the debate with their rendition of it, and they've done other ones, but this time Donald Trump was offended by it, and he came out making statements about this and saying how he was offended and he wanted them to stop doing it. This then resulted in even more media coverage about this. So now the media covered Trump's offense over SNL's news coverage of it, okay? So we're seeing a spiral of coverage, I suppose. It's a roll-on effect, and it's increasing the duration in the news media. So now I've fully described the coverage, the news coverage of this event with reference to depth and duration. I need to give my reasoned explanations for this now. So reasoned explanations, remember, can be audience expectations, news values, and political considerations. So this is why it was covered in the way it was covered. Why did it have that depth? And why did it have that duration? This is what you have to prove. So I'm just going to briefly talk about audience expectations first. And you can see here that I've talked about the fact that it's a current issue that's considered by the news media to be of higher importance to audiences, so of course they're going to cover it. US is a major political power in the world, so they're not just important to the USA but also to countries all across the globe. So this explains also why, in terms of the depth and duration of the coverage, New Zealand media gave it extensive coverage as well, because it's relevant to us even though we're not in the US. What the US does affects us. And I've put some more examples there. So, the New Zealand Herald did a as it happened, step-by-step rundown of the debate. And the second reasoned explanation I'm going to give is news values. We all need to talk about news values. These are one of the biggest reasons why news media decide to cover the stories they do. If a story has no news value, okay, if it doesn't have any of these things like prominence and personality, controversy, etc., then the news is not going to cover it. New Zealand Herald won't waste its time on it. But if it does have lots of these news values, that makes it newsworthy. It makes it worth covering because people want to read about it, they're going to read about it, they're going to click on the links, they're going to buy the newspapers, which is what it's all about for news media, okay? So I've talked here about prominence and personality, because obviously it features prominent figures that are important to the world, that are interesting to people. I've given an example of headlines emphasizing this, okay, and also controversy I've talked about here. So Inherent in debate is probably controversy, because by very nature, a debate is the clash of views, the clash of personalities. There's going to be some inflammatory comments made, things like that. So you might want to find examples of that to show that this is a controversial story. Therefore, it's probably going to be more entertaining and interesting and possibly shocking to audiences. But also, it was made even more controversial by the pre-debate press release of Donald Trump, which was drawing attention to Hillary Clinton's flaws and inappropriate comments being released that Donald Trump made about women in the locker room. So you're trying to prove that this particular event was full of controversy, therefore it made it covered in more depth and it made it covered in more duration. Right, this is your reasoned explanations for this. This is your proof. Now, it's really important that you spend a little bit of time linking back your discussion of those reasons, so linking your news values here, back to your aspect. So don't just talk about the news values, but link them back to depth and duration. Okay, so you can have a read of this section here, and I've talked about how the news value in the story, how the controversy, okay, and the prominence and personality all contributed to the duration and the depth of the coverage, right? So I've linked it back to my Guardian article, where the controversy meant that the Guardian put 4 different journalists offering their perspectives in the story, rather than just the one. Okay, I've also talked about the subsequent coverage of Donald Trump's outrage in the SNL satire. And so, obviously, the controversy about that resulted in more coverage, so it stayed in the media longer. So can you see the link between, right, the news value of controversy and the length of coverage, staying in the media longer? That is the link that you need to make. That's the proof, okay? So we can see how those things are connected. They are connected. Now, if you want to have a go at excellence, the only way you can get excellence here is if you do those other 2 steps right. So you explain the depth and duration, or the aspect that you've chosen, and you explain the effect of it, and you give reasoned explanations. So you have to do that, but you also have to explain implications of this coverage, which can be any of these things here. So if you are aiming for excellence, you want to think about what are possible effects, negative or positive, of the way the media covered this event, the second debate, okay? Are there negative ones in terms of stereotyping and representation? Maybe the SNL sketch you could talk about. Are there positive or negative implications of the way they covered it in terms of debate and discussion? That can be both a good thing and a bad thing, okay? Because it's healthy to have good debate and discussion in the public realm about this sort of thing, but also did the focus of what the media chose to pull out and focus on in their stories take away focus from important issues, okay? Because the media do have a strong influence as to what they highlight and emphasize, and therefore what people pay attention to. Remember our links on Classroom about agenda setting theory? And that is the whole idea of what the media choose to focus on impacts what people focus on and what people talk about. And this is where you can link to theory as well. Okay, so that theory, you'd want to get a quote, okay, about that. You could also link to the Bloomler and Katz theory. You could find quotes, okay, that can support this. But for excellence, we're looking for that X factor. So you do need to think out of the square and go beyond just the articles.